do another one. Let's do it. So now I want you guys to go to the part about women and Native Americans and Latinos fighting for change and basically everything that's going on with the 1960s and its social revolution, basically. We have people doing so much at this time, rallying, protesting, doing drugs, listening to rock and roll, and going to Woodstock, protesting Vietnam. There's a major moment going on here in American history. People have something to say because there is so much to say things about, right? There are so many things to look at and say, oh my God, we need to make this better. So you see all these different things happen, and these people are really emboldened by what happened in the civil rights movement with black people. And now all these different groups are going to say, yes, I too have something to fight for. I too want something more. I too want that freedom. Let's continue this conversation. Let's continue to fight for this. So you and I are going to talk about the women's movement in class, the women's liberation movement in the late 60s, early 70s. We're also going to talk about the counterculture, which is its own movement, and the hippies and everything that's going on there. And again, all this stuff blends, right? So many people from these other groups would agree with and be with and talk with people at this time, right? Not only are they sharing the same time and space, they have so many things in common. Keep in mind all this other stuff with Black Power, the Black Panthers, all going on at this time too. It's all layered on top of each other. So in this video, I'm quickly going to talk about 3 different groups that also have their own civil rights movements and are going to really get excited, protesting, civil disobedience, and fight for freedom. And that is Native Americans, the LGBTQ community, and Latinos. So they're each going to have their own movements as well in the late 60s, early 70s. So let's start with Native Americans. We know there is no shortage of things to rail against and say you are not getting enough of as a Native American in the past and in the 1960s and 70s. To recap, we had that policy of Americanization, and cutting the braids, putting people in boarding schools, absolutely terrible. The reservation system is going to be going, but we know by the 50s and 60s it's going to be rife with health problems, low education, alcoholism, cultural repression, you name it. And we know there have been some things to try to help, but this is really quite a devastating situation for Native Americans. Eisenhower tried something called termination. And termination was like, let's release Native Americans from reservations so they can become in mainstream society. When you have a population of people who suffer from alcoholism and drug abuse and all of this stuff and low education, and you just like move them, those problems follow them, right? There's a saying in the South, you can't run away from yourself, ain't no place that far. Like, you're not gonna just all of a sudden be in a city like Eisenhower planned and then like cease to be a Native American who never got a good education and who suffers from alcoholism. So there is that government-sponsored relocation, but it's not really successful. So from the rock bottom in the 60s comes this movement, and this movement's going to be called AIM, the American Indian Movement. And it is to kind of repossess, revitalize that Native American identity, culture, and fight for rights as full citizens. And if you remember, they became full citizens in 1920. So this is needed, this is necessary. Lots of things are going to happen, lots of civil disobedience. Native Americans are going to attempt to occupy Alcatraz in 1969. And this is, of course, the prison off the coast of San Francisco. Their reasoning was this is federal land and it's empty, and federal land that the government isn't using really always should belong to us. So they stake out, they stay there for a while. There's going to be a shootout at Wounded Knee, the site where the Wounded Knee massacre happened. Lots of activists and people go there, and there's actually a shootout with the government in the 60s. It's crazy. And this movement officially starts in 1968. Lots of different people. Russell Means, who we know from The Last of the Mohicans, he later on becomes this very famous actor, Native American actor. Clyde Bellecourt, big leaders here. Overall, this movement is going to have successes, but it still needs so much. We know this is still going on today. These movements don't stop. I don't want you to think about them like these neat little chapters in history. We're still fighting for the rights of African Americans, women, LGBT, Native Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, you name it. There's so many people that need help and that need more autonomy and full citizenship, and this doesn't end in this time. But we examine this, government theft of land and all this different stuff at this time. It's really being looked at, and in part of that, that's why we still really look at it today and say we need to fix it, right? So let's talk about to the LGBT community. So the gay rights movement Lots of people say the gay rights movement really started this infamous night in New York City in 1969 with something called the Stonewall riots. And there were people who were at Stonewall, and this Stonewall is like a club in New York City, and they are going to be gay, and they are going to, have a scuffle, and they are going to resist arrest. And when this happens, it's turned into like a bigger riot. It turns into a big discussion about gay rights and trans rights and everything else. And we can continue to follow this. Of course, the very historic court decision about gay marriage a few years ago. And I want you to stop and think. Today, we are kind of inundated with, people who have all different sexual identities and representations and all of that in television shows and in the radio, and we have Neil Patrick Harris, hosting all this stuff. I did not grow up in a time like that. When Modern Family came out, that was the first time you really saw somebody who was openly gay in a TV show, and that was not that long ago. So this is something that is so recent. This is something that's going to continue through the 70s. 1970 is going to be the first gay pride parade that ever happens, and we know that's going to continue, obviously, to be a huge tradition. And, Harvey Milk, very famous California politician, 1977, but we know he's going to be assassinated really because he is gay. So LGBT pride just continues to grow, and this is a really big issue that lots of people are plugged into, but once again, it is not an issue that is done. It is not an issue that is over. And when we talk about the 70s, there's this situation in 1979. It's a White Sox game in Chicago, obviously, and there was always this like disco hating contingent of people who really hated disco and were still into the punk rock and everything in the 70s. And they were all like the disco people, and they always fought, and people were like disco stinks and everything like this. So this one announcer at the White Sox game said, everyone, when we have the seventh inning stretch, bring your disco records and we'll destroy them on the field, because he hated disco. Well, this turns into not only a riot against disco, but an anti-gay riot. And if you're not sure how disco and the gay community are linked, you need to look at some Village People music videos, because that'll clear it up for you. But this becomes like this anti-gay riot, and it's just out of control in 1979. They have to call off the game. The rest of the baseball game can't even happen. People took to the field, crashing these records, burning them. It was crazy. So we know this is a problem in our country. We know this is there, but the seeds are kind of really planted with the gay rights movement really in the 1960s. And you and I will continue to talk about that when we talk about what the gay community goes through with the scourge and kind of that prejudice that people blame them for AIDS in the 1980s. And I'm sorry, I want to mention one other group of people, even though it's going to be much later, and that is anybody with a disability. This is obviously something that continues to be something we need to work on. Again, I know you guys are just used to having ramps and elevators and, things that are totally accessible for people with any kind of disability. That is new, you guys. That is brand new, that you had laws that said you have to do that. Some people could not even, go to a certain building for work because they couldn't get in because they were in a wheelchair. So the American with Disabilities Act, ADA, is going to be passed in 1990. And that's a huge part of the movement. It's still going on. We know a big part of this movement, too, how are children with disabilities given equal education opportunities, right? That's a really, really big part of it. And the last group I want to talk about are going to be Latinos. So we know today Latinos in our country are number one minority, right? Number one, which is just huge. So in 1960, there were almost 1 million Latinos in America. Many more today. We know a lot came in from the Bracero program in World War II. Lots of people came in as kind of the Okies saw to getting jobs in California at that time. And if you looked at Latinos in 1960, most of them are doing hard labor and low-paying jobs. You're picking fruit, you're working on farms, you're in construction, you're doing factory work. And just like we said with the civil rights movement for the black community, if you do not have that money, you do not have that voice and power. So without that money, they lack that voice. Without that power, they are not represented in the government. They're getting no laws or anything to help them. Lack of policies, programs, things like having bilingual education. Again, brand new. You would have all of these students failing in schools and not doing well because everything was in English and there was no translator, there was no teacher's aid, there was no ELA program, there was nothing, and it was just like, too bad, learn English. If we did that today with all of our different immigrants and all the different languages, we would have horrible problems with literacy that would then affect the workforce and everything else, and we know we need to have those programs in schools. Back then, no one cared, right? These are a low paid minority, and it was not registered. So the guy who really says we need to step up, organize together, and make a point is Cesar Chavez. Cesar Chavez, if you ever go anywhere in Texas, in California, there are like 1,000 Cesar Chavez high schools, boulevards, circles, avenues. He's everywhere. He is a really big deal. And in California, he is going to organize and lead this Latino migrant worker strike in 1965. And this is a really big deal because they might not be getting paid a lot, but they were like the force of picking any kind of fruit, picking any kind of farm work, anything like that. With them going on strike, food supply pretty much stops. So this strike is going to be successful, and you can see this picture of Cesar Chavez meeting with Bobby Kennedy. This is a big deal. More workers unionize, more people demand better rights. Other groups are going to pop up through the time. The Brown Berets fighting for social justice, Mayo, and again, you are hard pressed to find a school today, Florida, California, Arizona, that isn't bilingual. We have a lot here in Buffalo, but it isn't always the case. And kind of think about Black Power and how, you are taking your identity and you are saying, this is me, I'm not going to change to look more white, I'm not going to change to be like this, I'm going to celebrate my community, my ethnicity, who I am. Same thing going on in the gay rights movement, same thing going on with Americans with Disabilities, same thing going on with people who are Latino, same thing going on, as we said, with Native Americans. There's this acceptance and celebration instead of hiding of who you are, and we can all learn from that, right? And all these minority groups, whether we're talking about women, whether we're talking about blacks, whether we're talking about Latinos, Americans with disabilities, gay, anybody, it's all about your lack of choice, right? You should have choices in life. You should have those. And these groups are not being given those choices. And for the first time, they're saying, not good enough. And that is really empowering. That is really amazing. And we have a lot to learn from that ourselves. So with that in mind, I will sign off. Take care.